Welcome guys. This is going to be part 2 for your sanctions summary video. So in this one here, we are going to be covering the different types of courts available in Victoria, what the role of the jury is in a criminal trial, and finally a new area that's just been added to the study design this year is some of the difficulties faced by different groups in our criminal justice system. So getting stuck right in, when we have a look at our court system, it's really important to know that each court in Victoria has its own jurisdiction. And what that means is it has its power to hear a particular certain type of case, which we're going to go into. Each court has its own original jurisdiction. And what I mean by original jurisdiction is it's the ability to hear a case for the first time. So what that might mean is the magistrate's court has the original jurisdiction to hear summary offences, for example. And then another term we're going to throw in as well is what's known as the appellate jurisdiction. So it's when a case is heard for the second time. So what that generally means is someone has had their case heard in a lower court, they've been dissatisfied with the outcome that they've received, and they decide to appeal it or go to the appellate jurisdiction to have their case heard for a second time, to hopefully get like an outcome they're more happy with, for example. So looking at our court hierarchy in Victoria, it's really important to know that we structure it in like a hierarchy. So when you look down at the very bottom here, these are our lower courts. They're going to be hearing much more minor offences. And as we work our way up through the chain of our hierarchy, we start to hear more serious offences. Most of our appeals get heard in these higher courts as well. And then we also have at the bottom level some of our courts that help support our vulnerable groups, like the drug court, Koori Court for our First Nations people, and also the Children's Court for our younger individuals that may be involved with sort of youth crime. So I've sort of mapped it out here on the right. You might like to pause here and see, but as you can see on the top sentence here, this is what the types of cases they hear. So the Magistrates Court, for example, is commonly known for hearing summary offences and committal hearings. If we go to the Supreme Court Trial Division, they're most commonly known for your most serious indictable offences, but they also hear appeals from the county court. So generally, if you're up in the Supreme Court, you're getting charged for murder. If you're down here in the Magistrates Court, you're going to be charged with a minor offence such as speeding, for example. So moving on, when we look at our courts, pretty much every single court, they have two main roles when they're there. So the first role they're looking at doing is they need to determine a criminal case. So the whole reason you go to court in the first place is we want to determine the guilt of the person, and hopefully at the end of the case we can decide whether this person is guilty or not guilty. And they do this by providing specialization. So each court has their expertise in a certain area of case, and they're able to manage those cases accordingly. So this person here, the judge or the magistrate, they're going to be responsible for providing orders, directing the jury, giving direction to the case to ensure that they can ensure that we can get the outcome and determine whether a person is guilty and move on or not. The second one is pretty much only when we find a person guilty, we need to impose sometimes what's known as a sanction. And just to recap, a sanction is the outcome of a criminal case, generally known as a consequence. So if you're found guilty, you might be handed down a fine or a community corrections order or imprisonment, for example, because we need to impose some kind of consequence. So when we look at the court process, generally speaking, if you're going into court for an indictable offence, you're generally going to have two courts involved. The first court you're going to go to is to the Magistrates Court, and we're going to have a process known as a committal hearing. So if you're getting charged with a indictable offence such as murder, they might send you to the committal hearing first to see if there's enough evidence to justify going to trial. So if we don't have much evidence against you for this murder, and we want to go to trial, could be wasting everyone's time. So that's why we generally will use this first court process here to make sure we have sufficient evidence to say, yep, it's worth going to trial. There's plenty of evidence here that we have a case. And then once we've determined if there's enough evidence and we're good to go, we're going to go to the case where it's going to be heard, so the court where it's going to be heard, which in this case for a murder would be the Supreme Court Trial Division. And that's where we're going to see if the person is guilty or not, and they're going to go to trial here. So pretty straightforward. So this next slide here that we're looking at here basically breaks down everything that I've just spoken about into a nice, clear, concise table. So what I would really suggest doing is pausing and maybe summarizing these notes to get an idea of what is what. But most importantly for this SAC, what you need to know is what is the jurisdiction of each of the courts. But what you also need to be really aware of is if a court case is heard in the magistrate's court, for example, and I wanted to appeal it, where can I appeal it to? So in this case, I can appeal it to the Supreme Court Trial Division. So it's really important you know which court hears what types of cases, but also, more importantly, if someone is not happy with the outcome of their case, where are they able to go to get that case reheard? So like I said, perhaps pause it, take some notes on this one, kind of maps it out nice and clearly for you. So moving on, when we look at the jury in a criminal case in Victoria, generally speaking, how it works is our jury members are randomly selected from our community. So once you turn over the age of 18 years old, your name is essentially retrieved from the electoral roll and you can be asked to be on the jury. You don't necessarily have to know these little bits here, but I thought it's important to know that basically there are some people that are not allowed to be a part of the jury, such as police officers, for example, and there are some reasons where people can be, for example, excused from the jury if they've got like a chronic condition or poor health, for example. And also, lastly, some people can be disqualified if they've served an indictable offence at all. So the whole reason we go through this process here is to ensure as much fairness as possible, and we don't want certain people on the jury for a variety of reasons. So moving on to what you really do need to know, and your ability to link to cases is really, really important here. So we need to know a couple roles of the jury. There are more than 3 roles of the jury, but I've just kind of picked the 3 most important in my opinion to help you explain. So number 1 reason, the jury is there to decide the guilt or the innocence of the accused. There's going to be 12 people in the jury and they're there for basically listening to all the evidence that gets presented, and they need to basically determine, is this person getting charged? Are they guilty beyond reasonable doubt or are they not guilty? So generally speaking, what that means is if we're trying to charge someone with an indictable offence, we need 11 out of 12 people to say, yes, this person is guilty for that person to get charged. When we look at cases like murder, for example, we need all 12 members of the jury to say, yes, this person is guilty beyond reasonable doubt. Otherwise, that case is dismissed and we have to impanel a brand new jury. So for indictable offences, it's really important we're either getting majority verdict or we're getting that 12 out of 12 if it's a murder case. But a key word here you really want to stress when you talk about this role is we want to remain impartial. And what that means is we're being very objective, very free from any bias, and making sure we're not making any judgments. We're just listening to the facts as they come and using them to make a fair decision based on what's presented to us. Moving on to the second one, we're going to listen to all the evidence. So this can be a very challenging part of the case because if the case goes for a month, for example, you're going to have to listen to a variety of legal arguments from both parties. You're going to have to listen to a lot of witnesses and cross-examination. But during this time, it's really important that they're attentive, so they're paying attention to what's going on in the courtroom. And they have to come in with a very open and unbiased mind. So they can't have any assumptions about a person. They need to just basically listen to the case based on what they've been told. And then once they've got the evidence and they've listened to all the evidence, they basically go into a room outside of the court or behind the court, and they need to share the responsibility between those 12 people and come up to that decision. So it's a shared responsibility task with the jury. They need to all agree, discuss the evidence, and determine what the outcome should be. Moving on to the last one, probably one of the more important ones in terms of our jury, we want them to really basically abide by the principles of justice. We want everyone to receive justice, and how that looks is our system is completely open, so anyone can go and look to see how the court system works. You can go to any trial, like in the magistrate's court, for example, And what we really want to ensure is that the role of the jury is we want to make sure that they can understand what's happening. And that's why we mean things like legal jargon and complex concepts are really simplified, because we want the average member, like a jury person, to understand what's going on, and hopefully we can kind of achieve equality for both parties. So those are our three roles. Pretty straightforward. What you really need to be able to do is you'll most likely be given a case study, and you need to be able to say stuff like what would be the role of the jury in this particular case study. So you use these slides to sort of link to whatever case study you might be presented. So moving on, this is the last thing I'm going to cover for this video. So this is a brand new area of knowledge that has been added to the study design this year. And you're basically asked to look at the difficulties faced by these four particular groups. So every teacher is going to do this very differently. For my students, for example, I have got them to focus on one group specifically and do a research task on them, but it would be up to the discretion of your teacher as to how they have taught this particular one. But for the sake of this video, to keep it nice and short and sharp and not go through them all, I'm just going to be focusing on young people, some of the difficulties they face, and what we do to sort of overcome those difficulties. But yeah, depending on your teacher's way they've taught the content, you may need to know 2 of them, or you may need to know all of them. So just check with your teacher. So for young people, for example, a really big problem with young people can be the lack of understanding. So when they get charged with a crime, for example, they often don't understand the system, and then they have trouble engaging with it and utilizing it to best receive the most optimal outcome. In terms of the court processes, even though they are very simplified and brought down for the average person, there's still very complex processes and procedures, which makes it really difficult for anyone, but especially young people, to understand. And because of these complex processes and procedures, it leads to a lot of people basically going to court without a lawyer. So they go self-represented, and they don't always have the best outcome when they are self-represented, because they're not really trained in legal studies, they're not trained in the law, so they might not be able to present the best possible legal arguments and defenses, for example. The second one they have is the really negative effects that custody might have. So in Australia alone, roughly about 42.5% of people are returning back to prison within the first 1 to 2 years of leaving prison. So that means that prison doesn't essentially do a very effective job at, rehabilitating people. Secondly, a really bad one is that if you put people in an environment with other criminals, it's not really going to be the best for their mental health and influencing positive change. So putting young people in prison from an early age can just lead to them taking on a life of crime, can be really dangerous, and it can have drastic long-term effects. So some individuals will enter the system at 16 or 17 years old, and they might spend their whole life going in and out of the prison system just because they got exposed to it from an early age. So you can see that young people face a lot of difficulties, and we really don't want them in prison in the first place. We don't want anyone in prison, but especially young people, because we don't want them to enter that cycle of crime of being in and out of prison. So then those are the two kind of main difficulties they face. What do we do to address those difficulties to make sure we can make it a little bit more optimal for them? So what we have is we have things like community legal centers. So if you're a young person and you find yourself getting involved in some kind of criminal trouble, for example, you can go to a place in the community legal center called Youth Law, and these people are there to basically give you advice, guidance, support for your case, to make sure you go down the best path possible and avoid you getting into serious trouble, for example. So they're set up as a network to help support younger people under the age of 25. Another thing we use, which is really popular in Victoria, is what's known as a youth diversion program. So like it says in the name, it's to divert people away from crime. So generally this is for your low-level crimes, so summary offences, and generally it's for first-time offences. And the whole idea about giving someone a diversion program is like, hey, you've got a second chance here. Take it on board. You can avoid having a criminal record, which could be a permanent imprint on your future life. And hopefully by getting you involved in a diversion program, we can give you a lot of rehabilitation to avoid you from entering that cycle of offending and reoffending and etc. Okay, so yeah, that's young people. Just to close out this video for today, really make sure that you can distinguish or tell me the difference between an original and appellate jurisdiction. So just remember, your original jurisdiction is where a case is heard for the very first time. So the magistrates court original jurisdiction, they hear summary offences for the first time. And then also knowing the appellate jurisdiction of each court. So where can a person go to appeal from the magistrates court, for example? So that's what I'm sort of talking about on that second slide here. You can kind of appeal your case on a point of fact or a point of law, but really important to know which cases go to what courts when you do appeal. Next, the role of the jury. Remember, you just have 3 roles of the jury to remember. You generally will never get asked more than 2 to 3 roles of the jury, so that one's pretty straightforward. And like I said, your key skill is the ability to get given a case study or a piece of stimulus and talk about what the role of the jury would have been in your chosen case study. And lastly, in this video, I've focused on difficulties for young people, but just remember there are 3 other groups that are listed in the study design. So at your own discretion, maybe ask your teacher if you need to know all of them or you need to know just one of them, for example, and see how you go. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next video.